Namaskar and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm RAJIV Singh. In this episode of History Behind Headlines, we turn our focus to the United Nations, an organization born out of the devastation of the Second World War, with a promise to secure peace, protect human rights and foster cooperation among nations. Over the last 8 decades, the UN has been at the center of the world affairs, sometimes as a peacemaker, at times as a bystander. Today, we revisit its origins, examine its functioning, assess its achievements and failures, and explore the pressing challenges that question its relevance in a rapidly changing world order.
President Truman, Roosevelt's friend and successor, opened the conference by radio from Washington.
Delegates to the United Nations Conference on International Organization.
It is not the purpose of this conference to draft a treaty of peace in the old sense of that term. This conference will devote its energies and its labors exclusively to the single problem of setting up the essential organization to keep the peace. You are to write the fundamental charter.
The United Nations was born in 1945 to prevent another catastrophic world war and to provide a platform for collective action on issues that no state could solve alone. 80 years on, the UN remains most visible architecture of global governance, a sprawling family of agencies, treaties, peacekeepers, and legal instruments. Yet, the anniversary invites a hard question. Has the UN fulfilled the objectives enshrined in its charter, or has it ossified into an expensive ceremonial clubhouse for the powerful?
Whatever the cost may be, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing ground.
The UN emerged from the wreckage of the Second World War. Leaders who had witnessed Blitzkrieg, Auschwitz, and the atomic bomb sought to build mechanisms that would make another global conflagration unthinkable. The UN Charter, drafted in San Francisco and signed in June 1945, came into force on 24th of October 1945 after ratification by the major powers. It set out purposes and principles centered on maintaining international peace and security, respecting human rights, and promoting social and economic development. At the heart of the Charter lay a bargain. Major power consent would lock them into multilateral institutions in exchange for privileges that recognize their capacity to shape global outcomes. That bargain created tools, assemblies, tribunals, peacekeeping mechanisms, and specialized agencies that could be employed to prevent conflict, to deliver humanitarian relief, and to codify emerging norms of human rights, international law, and development cooperation. Central to the UN architecture is the Security Council, endowed with primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Its 5 permanent members, the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and China, were granted special privileges, most notably the veto, by which any single P5 member can block a substantive council resolution. This design reflected the hard realities of 1945, the need to secure the assent of the major wartime victors. But it also institutionalized an asymmetry that has become the source of recurrent paralysis. The paradox is plain. The Security Council was meant to enable collective security by harnessing the great powers. Instead, the veto can sometimes convert the Council into a forum for contestation among them, where member states perceive a threat to the interests of any P5 member. The Council becomes inert. The result is that the UN's political machinery works best when the great powers converge and is largely gridlocked when they do not.
The P5 was a structure that was designed so that there would be unanimity on terms of key issues, but at the same time, their personal interests would not be affected. And I think in this world today, where interests often override values, that sometimes has become a liability.
The UN's record is mixed, but several successes are unmistakable. UN peacekeeping has helped stabilize transition moments in countries such as Namibia, Cambodia, and Timor-Leste. While imperfect, UN mandates and blue-helmeted forces have created breathing space for political processes to unfold. The UN has been the principal forum for decolonization, providing a diplomatic home for newly independent states and a normative template for sovereignty and human rights. UN agencies and programs, UNESCO, WHO, UNICEF, UNHCR, the World Food Programme and others have delivered life-saving relief, coordinated refugee responses and driven disease eradication campaigns. The eradication of smallpox in 1980, led by the World Health Organization, a UN agency, is considered UN's signature achievement. The Millennium Development Goals and their successor, the Sustainable Development Goals, have helped focus international attention and funding on measurable development outcomes. UN conventions have created global legal standards on genocide, torture, refugees, and children's rights. The UN's moral authority has, however, been dented by failures to prevent mass atrocities. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda, in which roughly 8 lakh people were slaughtered, stands as an egregious example. Independent inquiries concluded that the UN failed because member states withheld political will and resources, and because the Secretariat and peacekeeping apparatus misread, misunderstood, or ignored urgent warnings. Srebrenica in 1995, where Bosnian Serb forces killed more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys in an area under UN protection, reinforced the bitter lesson that limited mandates, inadequate forces, and political caution can be lethal. In the 21st century, the UN's inability to stop or decisively shape outcomes in Syria and protracted humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen further expose the organization's limits when the P5 are divided. The ongoing Russia-Ukraine war has exposed the structural weakness of the UN in its most dramatic form. The very organization that was created in 1945 to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war has been unable to prevent or resolve the most serious conflict in Europe since the Second World War. The veto is the institutional mechanism that has allowed the P5 to convert collective security into collective politics. Over decades, the P5 have used the veto to shield allies, to block enforcement measures that could harm their interests, or to prevent scrutiny into actions they endorse. The veto power, meant as a safeguard in 1945, has today become the biggest weapon of the P5 to block any action that goes against their national interests. Patterns emerge. The United States has frequently blocked measures criticized by allies. Russia and the Soviet Union historically used vetoes to defend their geopolitical space. China of late has been decisive in matters it views as linked to sovereignty and its partners. The cumulative effect is institutional stasis. The Council can act when interests align, and it stalls when interests collide. India's claim to a permanent seat in the Security Council is strong on multiple grounds. It is the world's most populous country, an original UN member, an influential voice in decolonization and non-alignment. India is the largest troop-contributing country in UN history. Over the decades, India has deployed more than 250,000 peacekeepers across 49 missions. Currently, over 6,000 Indian troops are serving under the UN flag, often in the most dangerous terrains like Congo and South Sudan.
India deserves a permanent seat on the UN Security Council because of what India has become in these last 7-8 decades. And it does demand that there be a greater understanding and reform of the UN structure so that India can play its due role in this very important multilateral body.
Indian peacekeepers have earned global admiration, from protecting civilians during the Rwandan genocide to stabilizing Liberia and Sierra Leone. India has also lost more soldiers in UN peacekeeping missions than most other countries. Yet, despite this unmatched service record, India is denied a permanent seat on the Security Council. India remains a vocal proponent of reform and a member of the G4 grouping that includes Brazil, Germany and Japan. Together, India, Japan, Germany and Brazil represent a substantial portion of the world's population, economy and contributions to the UN. Yet, none of them enjoy permanent representation. This imbalance not only undermines the UN's credibility but also questions its democratic legitimacy. The narrative that India was formally offered a permanent seat and declined it in favor of China is widespread in popular accounts. But archival scholarship complicates the story. Recent research indicates that Washington entertained various ideas in the early Cold War years, and that informal approaches and shifting geopolitics made the environment fluid. Evidence of a single decisive offer that India rejected is thin and contested. What is clearer is that by the time the People's Republic of China obtained the China seat in the UN in 1971, India had missed the chance to convert its early UN leadership and its peacekeeping credentials into permanent Security Council status. Whether that was an avoidable diplomatic failure or a product of complex post-war politics remains debated among historians.
For anyone who's been through the history of the UN system and how it was created, we know that the permanent membership was offered to the victorious powers. And China at that time, represented by the Kuomintang, was one of those victorious powers because they were fighting the Japanese. And so the Chinese had been offered the seat. There is a legend going around about India being offered a seat, but there is no credible information that supports that particular hypothesis.
The United Nations cannot function without money, and in many ways, its budget has become the most potent tool of power politics. Every member contributes, but the scale of assessments varies according to the economic capacity of a nation. On paper, the system ensures fairness. In reality, however, it has created a hierarchy where financial clout often dictates political influence. The United States contributes nearly 22% of the UN's regular budget and around 25% of its peacekeeping budget. This makes it the single largest contributor. With this, Washington has often used its financial leverage to shape outcomes in its favor. UNESCO withdrawal 1984, 2011 and 2017. When UNESCO admitted Palestine as a full member in 2011, the US cut off funding around $80 million annually, roughly 22% of UNESCO's budget. This crippled UNESCO's programs for years. In 2017, the US formally withdrew from the organization, citing anti-Israel bias. Earlier, the US had also left UNESCO in 1984, rejoined in 2003, and then returned again in 2023. This also showed how funding could be used as a tool to punish agencies that take decisions not aligned with American foreign policy. Peacekeeping cuts 2017 to 2019. Under the Trump administration, the US demanded a reduction in UN peacekeeping budgets, arguing that other countries should shoulder more responsibility. The result was a $600 million cut across missions, which directly affected operations in South Sudan, Congo, and Haiti, some of the world's most fragile regions. Russia and China have increasingly used their weight in budget negotiations to protect allies and strategic partners. For instance, in 2018, both countries blocked attempts to increase funding for human rights monitoring in African peacekeeping missions, arguing that such measures interfered in the internal affairs of sovereign nations. These moves, while couched in principle, were in reality about shielding governments in Sudan and elsewhere that Moscow and Beijing backed. While the P5 used their financial and political clout, nations like Japan and Germany are caught in an ironic situation. Japan, the second largest contributor for decades, currently contributing around 8.5% of the regular budget, which has given more than Russia and even Britain or France, yet it remains outside the Security Council's permanent circle. Germany contributes around 6% of the budget, nearly equal to the UK and more than many P5 members. Despite its central role in stabilizing Europe and being one of the largest donors to humanitarian causes, it lacks veto power or permanent representation. Both countries repeatedly highlight that they pay without power, a structural flaw in the UN's architecture. This contradiction exposes a deeper flaw. While the P5 flex muscles using money and Japan and Germany use economic clout, India offers the human capital that keeps UN operatives alive. Still, it remains outside the core decision-making table. Africa, with 54 UN members and a growing economic and demographic presence, remains without permanent representation on the Security Council.
At India's initiative, the African Union was admitted as a permanent member of the G20. By doing so, we gave voice to an entire continent which has long been its due. This significant step in reform should inspire the United Nations, a much older organization, to also make the Security Council contemporary. Broad representation is, after all, a prerequisite for both effectiveness and credibility.
The African Union's Eagle-Winning Consensus and the Sirte Declaration demand that Africa be granted at least 2 permanent seats with full rights and privileges, including the veto, together with several additional non-permanent seats to correct the historical imbalance. African leaders argue that legitimacy and effectiveness require a council more reflective of contemporary global realities than the world of 1945.
For decades, the General Assembly has debated Security Council enlargement and veto reform. Proposals such as the G4 model that basically argues for adding a number of new permanent seats have broad support from some quarters. African proposals have broad regional support, and various compromise formulas have been floated. Yet, amending the UN Charter requires not only a 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, but also endorsement by each member of the P5.
In practice, a charter amendment that would diminish or redistribute privileges is subject to de facto veto by those whose privileges are at stake. The result is a structural conservatism. The council can be enlarged only with the acquiescence of those who benefit from the current rules. "80 years after its creation, the United Nations stands at a crossroads, a beacon of hope for some, but for many, a relic of the past. The pressing question is, has the UN become a relic of a bygone era? It would be an overstatement to declare the UN wholly obsolete. The organization remains indispensable for humanitarian relief, norm setting, technical cooperation and the coordination of refugees, health responses and development financing. Its agencies save lives and shape policy, but the UN's political organs, especially the Security Council, are badly out of sync with contemporary geopolitics. When the P5 are deeply divided, the Council's capacity to deliver collective security is constrained. In many crises, powerful regional actors, coalitions of the willing, or ad hoc international arrangements have stepped into the vacuum left by the Council's paralysis. Without sustained political will from the capitals, even the best technical blueprints will remain unimplemented. Political will matters. At 80, the UN is simultaneously an indispensable multilateral mechanism and an institution sorely in need of structural overhaul. Reform is politically difficult but urgent. Practical steps that could be pursued now include negotiating time-bound expansion of the Security Council that guarantees African representation and provides at least one new permanent seat in Asia for India. Introducing a binding code of conduct on the use of veto in situations of mass atrocity, possibly requiring more than one P5 concurrence for blocking humanitarian intervention mandates. Strengthening the Secretariat's capacity for early warning and preventive diplomacy, creating rapid, deployable UN verification teams to supervise complex sequencing in territorial disputes, and empowering the General Assembly to play a more active accountability role when the Council is paralyzed. The credibility and long-term relevance of the UN will ultimately be judged by how effectively it responds to ongoing conflicts across different regions of the world, whether in Europe, the Middle East, Africa or Asia, where millions look to it for peace, justice and humanitarian relief.
If we look at the conflict situations around the world today, whether it's in Ukraine or in the Palestine, we find that the UN is unable to come to a consensus that can actually bring about peacekeeping operations or to bring about a process which induces a dialogue and diplomacy-based approach to resolve those issues. We need new structures that will be much more responsive to the developments on the ground.
The UN at 80 is a living paradox. It embodies the aspirations of a world that vowed never again after 1945, and it bears witness to the limits of a system built to secure the ascent of the victors of a bygone war.
The challenge before the United Nations as it enters its 9th decade is clear. To align its institutional form with contemporary substance, it must reform its decision-making, broaden representation, and equip itself with the tools and political will to translate lofty ideals into tangible action. Only then can the UN move beyond being a forum for speeches and debates. Only then can it truly claim to be the guardian of collective security, justice, and human dignity in the 21st century. That is all we have in this program. Thanks for watching.
To watch more programs of Sansad TV, subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to like and share them.